Blood trickled down Elizabeth Anderson's face as she stumbled through the dusty streets of Agua Caliente, Arizona, in the summer of 1878. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the humiliation of the townsfolk's laughter echoing behind her. "Look at the fancy Boston lady now," jeered Orville Jenkins, the saloon owner's son, as his friends hooted with cruel delight. "Not so proper when you're face down in the dirt, are you?" Elizabeth wiped the blood from her split lip with trembling fingers. She had only been in Arizona territory for 3 days, having arrived on the stagecoach from Boston after her father's death left her with nothing but debts, and a name no longer respected in proper society. The letter from her distant cousin offering her a position teaching at the Agua Caliente schoolhouse had seemed like salvation. But Agua Caliente was no salvation. It was hell disguised as a dusty frontier town, where the men were crude, the women suspicious, and children ran wild through unpaved streets. Her first meeting with the town council had gone poorly when she suggested implementing standard educational practices from back east. Then today, while carrying her books to what would have been her first day at the schoolhouse, someone had deliberately tripped her, sending her sprawling into the street. "You should go back where you came from," called Martha Steele, the milliner's wife. "We don't need your fancy ideas here." Elizabeth gathered what dignity she could and pushed herself to her feet. Her once fine blue dress was torn at the knee, and her carefully pinned hair had come loose, falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. Just as she managed to stand, a child, one of the Weaver boys, she thought through a clod of dirt that hit her squarely in the back. She couldn't help it. The pain, humiliation, and crushing disappointment overwhelmed her. Elizabeth Anderson, who had been raised to never show emotion in public, screamed a raw, guttural sound that tore from her throat and echoed through the street. The laughter intensified. Men slapped their knees, women covered their mouths with their hands, and children pointed and giggled. "They laughed when I screamed," she cried, not speaking to anyone in particular, just voicing her disbelief at such cruelty. "Then let them hear us laugh louder." The deep voice came from behind her. Elizabeth turned to find herself facing the tallest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin. His dark blonde hair curled slightly at the edges of his Stetson, and his eyes were the piercing blue of a desert sky. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy: dusty jeans, a faded work shirt, and worn boots, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who answered to no one. "Who?" Elizabeth began, but the cowboy had already moved past her, placing himself between her and the laughing crowd. "Folks of Agua Caliente," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the street. "Is this how you welcome a lady to our town?" The laughter died down, replaced by awkward shuffling. "Because if it is, I reckon I've been living in the wrong place all these years." "Stay out of it, Drake," Orville Jenkins called. "This ain't your business." "I'm making it my business," the cowboy Drake replied evenly. "Miss Anderson came here on invitation to teach our children. Mayor Holly sent for her himself." "We don't need no city woman teaching our kids airs above their station," Martha Steele called out. Drake nodded as if considering this. "Maybe so. But I recall every last one of you complaining that your children can't cipher numbers or read more than their names. Miss Anderson here graduated from a proper school back east." Elizabeth stared at the cowboy's back, wondering how he knew this about her. "She's stuck up," someone called. "Told us our school ain't good enough," Drake shrugged. "Can't say I blame her. That schoolhouse has a leaky roof and benches that'd give a mule splinters." He turned back to Elizabeth, his eyes softening. "Miss Anderson, I believe we haven't been properly introduced," Drake Irwin, owner of the Double I Ranch. He tipped his hat to her. And I'd be honored if you'd accept my escort to Doc Henderson's office to tend to that cut. Elizabeth was so stunned by the sudden turn of events that she simply nodded. Drake offered his arm, and as she took it, he leaned down to whisper, "Smile like you're enjoying the finest joke ever told." "What? Trust me. Laugh." And with that, Drake Irwin threw back his head and laughed, a booming, genuine sound that seemed to fill the entire street. After a moment of confusion, Elizabeth understood his strategy. Summoning every acting skill she'd learned in school performances, she joined in with a light, musical laugh that sounded nothing like the scream that had torn from her throat moments before. Together, they laughed as they walked away from the stunned crowd, her arm tucked securely in his, her head held high despite the blood on her face and the dirt on her dress. "That's right," Drake called over his shoulder to the silent onlookers. "The joke's on you." By the time they reached Doc Henderson's small office at the end of the street, Elizabeth's forced laughter had faded, and she felt light-headed from the ordeal. Drake seemed to sense her weakness, for his hand moved to support her elbow more firmly. "Almost there, Miss Anderson," he said quietly. "Just a few more steps." The doctor's office was mercifully empty. A small bell jangled as they entered, and moments later, an elderly man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed white beard emerged from a back room. "Drake Irwin," the doctor said with obvious fondness. "What trouble have you gotten yourself into now?" Then his eyes fell on Elizabeth, and his expression sobered immediately. "My dear, what happened to you?" "A welcoming committee," Drake said dryly. "Doc, this is Miss Elizabeth Anderson, our new schoolteacher." "Ah, yes. Mayor Holly's mentioned you were arriving." The doctor ushered her to a chair. "Those cuts need cleaning. I can see dirt in them, and infection is no small matter out here." As the doctor worked, gently dabbing at her face with disinfectant that stung fiercely, Elizabeth studied Drake Irwin. He had removed his hat, revealing thick hair the color of wheat that curled slightly at the ends. His face was weathered from years in the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes suggesting he was in his early 30s. Despite his rough appearance, there was something refined about the way he held himself, a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with the frontier town. "Why did you help me?" Elizabeth asked suddenly. Drake, who had been staring out the window, turned to meet her gaze. "Because what they did wasn't right. But you don't know me. For all you know, I could be exactly what they said, stuck up and full of airs." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Are you?" Elizabeth considered the question honestly. "I don't believe so. But I do have ideas about education that might seem progressive to people here." "This town needs progressive ideas, Miss Anderson. We're stuck 10 years behind the rest of the country out here." Dr. Henderson finished cleaning her cuts. "No stitches needed, thankfully. The lip will be sore for a few days, but it should heal cleanly. The scrape on your cheek is superficial." He handed her a small jar. "Apply this salve morning and night." "Thank you, doctor. What do I owe you?" The doctor waved away her question. "Consider it a proper welcome to Agua Caliente to make up for the improper one you received." Drake settled his hat back on his head. "I'll see Miss Anderson to her lodgings, Doc." Outside, the street had returned to its normal midday bustle, though Elizabeth noticed several people pointedly looking away as they passed. Drake offered his arm again, and she took it gratefully. "I'm staying at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house," she said. "I know. It's the only decent place in town for a lady on her own." Drake guided her toward a 2-story wooden building with a small porch. "Mrs. Whittaker's a fair woman. She won't hold the town's behavior against you." "Mr. Irwin, Drake, please." "Drake. I appreciate your gallantry, but I'm not sure I can stay in Agua Caliente after what happened today." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Where would you go? The question struck her like a physical blow. Where indeed? She had spent the last of her inheritance on the journey west. Her parents were dead, her family home sold to pay debts, and her friends in Boston had quickly distanced themselves when the Anderson name became associated with financial ruin after her father's failed investments came to light. I don't know, she admitted. Then stay. At least until you have a plan. His blue eyes were kind but unwavering. Don't let them win so easily, Miss Anderson. Elizabeth, she corrected. If I'm to call you Drake, then you must call me Elizabeth. He smiled, and something warm unfurled in her chest. Elizabeth, then. He gestured toward the boarding house. Rest today. Tomorrow I'll come by with my wagon and take you to the schoolhouse. We'll assess what needs fixing before the term starts next Monday. Why are you doing this? Drake was quiet for a long moment. Because 20 years ago, I was a scared kid who couldn't read, and a teacher from back east took the time to teach me when everyone else had given up. Changed my life. His gaze met hers steadily. Maybe you'll do the same for some child here. With that, he tipped his hat and left her at Mrs. Whittaker's door, striding back toward the center of town with the easy gait of a man who knew his own mind. Elizabeth watched him go, feeling oddly bereft at his departure. Then she squared her shoulders and knocked on the boarding house door. If Drake Irwin believed she could make a difference in Agua Caliente, perhaps she should give herself the chance to try. Mrs. Whittaker turned out to be a plump, pleasant woman in her 50s who exclaimed with genuine concern over Elizabeth's injuries. Land sakes, child. Come in, come in. I heard about the commotion in town. She ushered Elizabeth into a neat parlor and bustled off to make tea. Don't you mind those fools. Half of them can't write their own names and are jealous of anyone who can. The tea was strong and sweet, exactly what Elizabeth needed. As she sipped it, Mrs. Whittaker continued her motherly fussing. Now, I've put you in the room at the back of the house. It's smaller, but it gets the morning sun and has a little desk for your schoolwork. She patted Elizabeth's hand. And I saw Drake Irwin escorting you. That man's worth his weight in gold, mark my words. He was very kind, Elizabeth agreed. Mrs. Whittaker snorted. Kind doesn't begin to cover it. Drake Irwin built half this town with his own 2 hands. His ranch employs 15 men year-round, more during cattle drives. He funded the new well in the town square last year when the old one dried up. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Every unmarried woman in 3 counties has set her cap for him, but he keeps to himself mostly. Elizabeth felt a blush creeping up her neck. He's offered to help me assess the schoolhouse tomorrow. Has he now? Mrs. Whittaker's eyes twinkled. Well, that's interesting. Very interesting indeed. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the small but clean room, Elizabeth found herself thinking of Drake Irwin's steady blue eyes and the way he had laughed with her in the street, turning her humiliation into a moment of triumph. It had been a long time since anyone had stood up for her, not since her father was alive. She touched her split lip gently, wincing at the tenderness. Perhaps Drake was right. Perhaps she should stay, at least long enough to prove to herself and to the town that she wasn't easily defeated. With that resolution made, Elizabeth fell into a dreamless sleep, exhausted by the day's events, but somehow more hopeful than she had been since leaving Boston. Morning came with golden light streaming through her window, just as Mrs. Whittaker had promised. Elizabeth dressed carefully in one of her simpler dresses, a dove gray cotton with minimal trim, and pinned her chestnut hair into a practical bun. Her face in the small mirror above the washstand showed a nasty scrape on her right cheek and a swollen lip, but the physical damage was less concerning than the blow to her confidence. Breakfast was served promptly at 7 in the boarding house dining room. Elizabeth was the only woman among the boarders. The others were a land surveyor, a clerk from the general store, and an elderly gentleman who had once been a judge back in Missouri. All three men nodded politely to her, but said little during the meal of flapjacks, bacon, and strong coffee. At precisely 8 o'clock, a wagon pulled up outside the boarding house. Elizabeth watched from the window as Drake Irwin set the brake and jumped down from the seat with the easy grace of a man accustomed to physical labor. Today, he wore a clean blue shirt and had clearly made an effort to brush the trail dust from his clothes, though his boots still bore the marks of ranch work. Mrs. Whittaker answered his knock and ushered him into the parlor where Elizabeth waited. The room suddenly seemed smaller with his tall form filling it. "Good morning, Miss Anderson," he said, hat in hand. "I hope you slept well despite yesterday's tribulations." "Quite well, thank you," she gestured to her face. "It looks worse than it feels." His expression darkened briefly. "Still, it shouldn't have happened. Are you ready to see the schoolhouse?" The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple one-room building with a small bell tower. As Drake had warned, the roof showed obvious signs of leakage, with water stains marring the ceiling. The benches were rough-hewn and indeed looked capable of delivering splinters to unwary students. A pot-bellied stove stood in one corner, its pipe disappearing through the ceiling, and a battered teacher's desk occupied the front of the room. Elizabeth walked slowly around the space, mentally cataloging all that needed improvement. The blackboard was cracked in one corner, there were no maps or educational materials visible, and the few books stacked on a shelf were worn nearly to illegibility. "Well," she said finally, "it needs work." Drake had been watching her silently, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "What would you do first?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "The roof needs repair before the rainy season. The benches should be sanded and properly finished to prevent injuries. We need books, real books, not just these cast-offs. And maps, slates for the children to practice on, proper chalk." She trailed off, realizing how overwhelming the list was becoming. To her surprise, Drake was nodding. "All reasonable. I can have my ranch hands fix the roof this week. One of them, Enrique, used to be a carpenter in Mexico. He can look at the benches too." "Mr. Irwin, Drake, I can't ask you to do all that," he shrugged. "You didn't ask, I offered." His gaze swept the room. "Education matters, Elizabeth. This town won't grow without it." The town council didn't seem to think so yesterday. The town council is mainly concerned with who gets what contracts and which saloon stays open latest. He smiled wryly. "They'll come around when they see results." Elizabeth walked to the teacher's desk, running her fingers over its scarred surface. "You really think I can make a difference here?" "I do." Drake crossed the room to stand beside her. "But you need to believe it too." She looked up at him, struck again by his height and the quiet strength he exuded. "Why do you care so much? You mentioned a teacher who helped you, but there seems to be more to it." Drake was silent for a long moment. "My father couldn't read," he said finally. "Smart man, built a ranch from nothing, but he signed his name with an X. It shamed him, though he never said so directly. When I was 8, a schoolteacher passing through spent the winter at our ranch. By spring, I could read simple books. By the time I was 12, I was reading everything I could get my hands on." He met her eyes directly. "Education changes lives, Elizabeth. It changed mine." The intensity of his gaze made her heart beat faster. She looked away, flustered. "Well then, let's make a list of what we need." They spent the morning taking inventory and making plans. Drake proved to be practical and knowledgeable, with a clear understanding of what could be achieved before school started the following Monday. By noon, they had a comprehensive list of repairs and supplies. "The general store will have some of what we need," Drake said as they locked up the schoolhouse. "We can order the rest from Tucson. It won't arrive before school starts, but it should come within a few weeks." "I have some educational materials in my trunks," Elizabeth offered. "Primers, a geography text, some literature, not enough for everyone but a start." Drake helped her into the wagon. "That's the spirit. We work with what we have and build from there." He climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Are you hungry? Mrs. Whitaker packed us a lunch. I thought we could eat by the creek outside town. It's cooler there." The suggestion was improper by Boston standards, an unmarried woman dining alone with a man, away from chaperones, but Elizabeth was beginning to understand that frontier rules were different. Besides, after Drake's kindness, she trusted him in a way she had trusted few men since her father's death. "That sounds lovely," she said. The creek was a small oasis of green in the otherwise brown landscape, with cottonwood trees providing dappled shade and water burbling gently over smooth stones. Drake spread a blanket on the ground and unpacked Mrs. Whitaker's generous lunch: fried chicken, biscuits, apple preserves, and a jar of lemonade. As they ate, Elizabeth found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving in Arizona. Drake was easy to talk to, interested in her ideas about education but never condescending. He told her about his ranch, the Double I, named for his father Isaac Irwin, and about the challenges and rewards of cattle ranching in the territory. "It's not an easy life," he admitted, "but I love it. There's nothing like watching the sun rise over land that's yours, knowing you've built something that will last." "I envy that sense of permanence," Elizabeth said quietly. "Since my father died, I've felt adrift." "What happened, if you don't mind my asking?" Elizabeth sighed. "My father was a merchant in Boston, successful, respected. But he made some poor investments in the Panic of '73. By the time he died last year, there was nothing left. My mother had passed years before, so I was alone." She plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. "I worked as a governess for a while, but when my cousin wrote about the teaching position here, well, it seemed like a chance to start fresh. And it will be," Drake said firmly. "Once the children actually meet you, their parents will come around. I hope you're right." They returned to town in the late afternoon. As Drake helped Elizabeth down from the wagon in front of the boarding house, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "I'll send Enrique and some men to start on the roof tomorrow. Will you be all right going to the general store on your own?" "I have ranch business to attend to." "I'll be fine," Elizabeth assured him. "Thank you for everything today." He tipped his hat. "My pleasure, Miss Anderson." As she watched him drive away, Elizabeth felt a curious mixture of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, for his unexpected assistance. But there was something else too, a flutter of awareness that had nothing to do with thankfulness, and everything to do with the way his blue eyes crinkled when he smiled. Mrs. Whitaker met her at the door with a knowing look. "Had a nice day with Mr. Irwin, did you?" Elizabeth felt a blush creeping up her neck. "It was productive. We made plans for fixing up the schoolhouse." "Hum," Mrs. Whitaker said, clearly unconvinced by Elizabeth's businesslike tone. "Well, you might want to know that several ladies from town called while you were gone. Seems they've had a change of heart about the new schoolteacher." "Really? Why?" Mrs. Whitaker chuckled. "Word gets around fast in Agua Caliente. When folks heard Drake Irwin himself was helping fix up the schoolhouse, well, suddenly your Eastern education seemed mighty valuable." "That's ridiculous. My qualifications haven't changed since yesterday." "No, but your champion has. Drake Irwin carries weight in this town." Mrs. Whitaker patted her arm. "Use that to your advantage, dear." The next morning, Elizabeth ventured to the general store alone. She braced herself for more hostility, but to her surprise, the storekeeper greeted her cordially. "Miss Anderson, welcome. Mr. Parsons at your service." He was a thin man with spectacles and a neat mustache. "I understand you're looking for school supplies." "Yes, I have a list here." She handed him the paper she and Drake had prepared. Mr. Parsons reviewed it carefully. "I can provide the chalks, slates, and basic primers. For the maps and more advanced texts, we'll need to order from Tucson." He looked up with a smile. "No charge for the local items. Consider it the store's contribution to education." Elizabeth was taken aback by the sudden generosity. "That's very kind, but unnecessary." "Nonsense. Education benefits us all." He leaned forward slightly. "Besides, my boy Tommy can barely write his name. His mother and I would be grateful for any improvement." As she left the store with her purchases, Elizabeth noticed other changes in the town's attitude. People nodded to her on the street. A woman she recognized from the crowd yesterday actually approached to introduce herself as Mrs. Carter, mother of 3 school-age children. "I want to apologize for yesterday," Mrs. Carter said, looking genuinely contrite. "It was shameful behavior. We're not usually so unwelcoming." Elizabeth accepted the apology graciously, though she suspected Drake's involvement was the real reason for the woman's changed attitude. Still, it was progress. At the schoolhouse, she found Enrique and 2 other men already at work on the roof. Enrique, a middle-aged Mexican man with graying hair and kind eyes, touched his hat respectfully. "Señorita Anderson, buenos dias. Mr. Irwin said we are to fix everything to your satisfaction." "Thank you, Enrique. I appreciate the help. Ease un placer. Mr. Irwin, he is a good man. If he says you are important to the town, then it is so." Elizabeth spent the day cleaning the schoolhouse while the men worked above. By late afternoon, the roof repairs were nearly complete, and she had scrubbed the floors and windows until they shone. She was arranging her meager book collection on the shelf when a shadow fell across the doorway. "Making progress, I see," Drake said, surveying her work with approval. Elizabeth turned with a smile, surprised at how pleased she was to see him. "The men have been wonderful. The roof doesn't leak anymore. And you've been busy, too." He crossed to examine the books she'd arranged. "Quite a collection for a one-room schoolhouse." "It's not enough, but it's a start." Drake nodded, then reached into his saddlebag. "I brought something. Found it in my father's things years ago, never had much use for it myself." He handed her a book bound in faded leather. Elizabeth opened it carefully. "A History of the United States," she read from the title page. "Published 1850. It's not new, but the information is still good. Thought it might help with history lessons." The gesture touched her deeply. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that went beyond their shared project. Drake cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should check on the men. Enrique says they'll finish the roof tomorrow, then start on the benches." "Drake," Elizabeth called as he turned to leave. He looked back, eyebrows raised in question. "Would you? That is. Mrs. Whittaker mentioned a social at the church this Saturday. Will you be attending?" A slow smile spread across his face. "I hadn't planned to, but if you're asking if I'd escort you, the answer is yes." Elizabeth felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Then yes, I'm asking. I'll pick you up at 6. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Elizabeth staring after him with a fluttering heart that had nothing to do with the prospect of making a good impression on the townspeople, and everything to do with spending an evening in Drake Irwin's company. The rest of the week passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Drake's men completed the roof repairs and transformed the splintery benches into smooth, polished seating. Elizabeth organized her limited supplies, prepared lesson plans, and continued cleaning the schoolhouse until it sparkled. Word spread through town that the new school teacher was determined to provide a proper education, and gradually, the initial hostility gave way to cautious acceptance. Several mothers even stopped by to introduce themselves and their children, eager to make a good impression before classes began. Through it all, Drake was a constant presence, stopping by daily to check on progress and often bringing small, thoughtful gifts: a map he'd found in Tucson, a box of colored chalks, a set of readers someone at the ranch had outgrown. Each time he visited, Elizabeth found herself looking forward to his arrival more eagerly, her heart racing whenever his tall form appeared in the doorway. Saturday evening arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of desert flowers. Elizabeth dressed with special care in her best remaining gown, a deep blue silk that she had managed to save from her Boston days. Mrs. Whittaker helped her style her hair, arranging the chestnut waves in a softer fashion than Elizabeth usually wore. "There, Mrs. Whittaker said, stepping back to admire her work. "Pretty as a picture. Drake Irwin won't know what hit him." "Mrs. Whittaker," Elizabeth protested, blushing, "it's not like that." The older woman just smiled knowingly. "If you say so, dear." Drake arrived promptly at 6, and Elizabeth's breath caught at the sight of him. He had exchanged his usual ranch clothes for a black suit, crisp white shirt, and string tie. His hair was neatly combed, and his boots polished to a shine. He looked like a different man, no less commanding, but polished in a way that reminded her that, beneath the cowboy exterior, was a man of substance and intelligence. His expression, when he saw her, made Elizabeth's heart skip. His blue eyes widened, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. "Miss Anderson," he finally managed, "you look beautiful." "Thank you," she said softly. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Irwin." He offered his arm with a smile. "Shall we?" The church social was held in the small community hall adjacent to Agua Caliente's white-steepled church. As they entered, Elizabeth was aware of heads turning and conversations pausing. Being escorted by Drake Irwin apparently made her an object of intense interest. "Ignore them," Drake murmured close to her ear. "They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough." The hall was decorated with paper streamers and wildflowers. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and a small group of musicians played lively tunes in the corner. Couples were already dancing, while clusters of people chatted around the edges of the room. Drake led Elizabeth to greet Reverend Collins, a jovial man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and twinkling eyes. "Miss Anderson, a pleasure to welcome you properly to our community." The Reverend pumped her hand enthusiastically. "And Drake, good to see you at a social event for once. Usually takes a cattle stampede to get you into town on a Saturday night." Drake smiled easily. "Had a better reason this time, Reverend." The evening progressed pleasantly. Elizabeth was introduced to what seemed like the entire population of Agua Caliente, and while some still regarded her with suspicion, most were welcoming, especially after seeing her with Drake. She met several of her future students, who eyed her with the mixture of curiosity and wariness that children reserve for teachers. Through it all, Drake remained attentively by her side, his hand occasionally resting lightly at the small of her back as he guided her through the crowded room. Each touch sent a thrill through her that both alarmed and excited her. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Drake turned to her with a raised eyebrow. "May I have this dance, Miss Anderson?" "I'd be delighted, Mr. Irwin." His hand at her waist was warm and steady as he led her onto the dance floor. Elizabeth had learned to dance at finishing school in Boston, but she had never had a partner who moved with such natural grace. For a man who spent his days on horseback, Drake waltzed with remarkable skill. "You're surprised," he noted, reading her expression. "A little," she admitted. Where did a cowboy learn to waltz so well? His eyes crinkled with amusement. Same place I learned to read. That teacher who stayed with us was a firm believer in a well-rounded education. They moved in perfect harmony, and Elizabeth found herself relaxing into his lead, enjoying the strength of his arm around her and the way he navigated them effortlessly through the other couples. "People are watching us," she murmured, catching several curious glances. "Let them watch." His voice was low, meant only for her. "They're just surprised to see the Boston school teacher and the local rancher getting along so well." "Is that what we're doing? Getting along well?" Drake's gaze intensified and his hand pressed slightly firmer against her back. "I'd say we're doing considerably better than just getting along, wouldn't you, Elizabeth?" The way he said her name with a gentle emphasis on the first syllable made her pulse quicken. "Yes," she whispered. "I would." The music ended too soon. Drake reluctantly released her, though he kept her hand tucked in his arm as he led her to get refreshments. They were standing near the punch bowl, engaged in conversation with the mayor and his wife, when Orville Jenkins approached, his expression hostile. "Well, if it isn't the schoolmarm and her protector," he said loudly, his words slightly slurred from whiskey. "Quite a cozy arrangement you two have worked out." Drake stiffened beside Elizabeth. "Jenkins, you're drunk. Go home before you embarrass yourself further." "Embarrass myself?" Jenkins laughed harshly. "That's rich, coming from a man who's letting a city woman lead him around by the nose. What's she giving you that's worth turning against your own kind, Irwin?" The hall had gone silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Elizabeth felt sick with humiliation. It was like the first day in town all over again. Only worse, because now the insult encompassed Drake as well. Before Drake could respond, Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. "Mr. Jenkins, I understand you have concerns about an outsider teaching your children. That's your right. But Mr. Irwin has shown me nothing but proper courtesy, and I won't stand by while you impugn his character or mine." Jenkins sneered. "Listen to those fancy words. Think you're better than us, don't you?" "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I simply want to teach children who deserve a good education, regardless of where they come from or who their parents are." There was a murmur of approval from several parents in the crowd. Jenkins looked around, realizing he was losing his audience. "You'll regret coming here," he threatened, jabbing a finger toward Elizabeth. "Both of you will regret it." With that, he stumbled out of the hall. In the awkward silence that followed, Drake placed a protective hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "I believe you promised me another dance, Miss Anderson." The musicians, taking their cue, quickly struck up another tune, and gradually the party atmosphere returned. But the incident had cast a shadow over the evening. Elizabeth went through the motions of dancing and socializing, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. Drake, sensing her mood, suggested they leave early. Outside in the cool night air, Elizabeth finally let her composure slip. "I'm sorry," she said miserably. "I've caused you trouble in your own community." "Nonsense." Drake took her hands in his. "Jenkins is a fool who's been causing trouble since he was in short pants. No one pays him any mind. But the things he implied are not worth repeating or remembering." Drake's voice was gentle but firm. "Elizabeth, look at me." She raised her eyes to his. "I don't care what Orville Jenkins or anyone else in this town thinks about our friendship." He hesitated on the last word as if uncertain it was the right term. "What matters is that you're doing good work here. The schoolhouse is ready. The children need you, and he stopped, seeming to search for words. "You what?" Elizabeth prompted softly, her heart suddenly racing. Drake's eyes held hers, intense and sincere. "I've never met anyone like you. Your courage, your determination, your kindness." They humble me." His hands tightened on hers. "I know we've only known each other a week, but I feel as if I've been waiting for you all my life." The words hung in the night air between them, honest and vulnerable. Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from a sudden, overwhelming joy. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "It makes no sense we're so different from such different worlds." "None of that matters," Drake interrupted. "What matters is this." And with that, he gently cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. His lips were soft against hers, the kiss tender and questioning. Elizabeth's hands found their way to his shoulders, and she responded with a fervor that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "Well," Drake said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "I think that settles the question of whether this is merely a friendship." Elizabeth laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Indeed it does, Mr. Irwin." He escorted her back to the boarding house, both of them walking slowly, reluctant for the evening to end. At the door, he kissed her again, more briefly but with no less feeling. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked. "After church services, I'd like that very much." With a final squeeze of her hand, he left her, walking back toward the hitching post where his horse waited. Elizabeth watched him go, her heart full of a happiness she had never expected to find in the dusty streets of Agua Caliente. The next day dawned bright and clear. Elizabeth attended church services with Mrs. Whittaker, acutely aware of Drake sitting across the aisle with several of his ranch hands. He caught her eye during the opening hymn and smiled warmly, causing her to lose her place in the hymnal. After the service, Drake approached as promised, asking if she'd care to join him for a Sunday drive. Mrs. Whittaker, with a knowing smile, assured Elizabeth she'd keep a plate warm for her if she missed the boarding house's midday meal. This time, Drake had brought a buggy rather than the wagon, a clear indication that this was a social call rather than a practical outing. As they drove through the outskirts of town and into the surrounding countryside, Elizabeth marveled at the stark beauty of the landscape. The desert, which had seemed so alien to her upon arrival, was beginning to reveal its charms: the subtle colors of the rock formations, the unexpected bursts of wildflowers, the vast open sky that seemed to go on forever. "It grows on you, doesn't it?" Drake asked, noticing her admiring gaze. "It does. I never thought I'd say this, but there's a beauty here that's unlike anything I've seen before." "I'd like to show you my ranch," Drake said. "It's about 5 miles out of town. Would that be acceptable?" The proper Boston lady in Elizabeth knew that visiting a bachelor's home, even a ranch with workers present, pushed the boundaries of propriety. But the woman who had screamed in the street and laughed in the face of cruelty a week ago found herself nodding eagerly. "I'd love to see it." The Double I Ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, a sprawling complex of buildings nestled in a valley with a creek running through it. The main house was substantial, built of local stone and timber, with a broad porch wrapping around it. Nearby stood a large barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. In the distance, cattle grazed on the sparse grass and horses moved about in a corral closer to the main house. "Drake, it's beautiful," Elizabeth exclaimed. Pride was evident in his voice as he replied, "My father started with nothing but 100 acres and 10 head of cattle. Now we run over 2,000 head on 20,000 acres. He guided the buggy toward the main house. "It's not grand by Eastern standards, but it's home." Several ranch hands called greetings as they drove up, tipping their hats respectfully to Elizabeth. A Mexican woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Senor Drake, we did not expect you back so soon." Her eyes lit up when she saw Elizabeth. "And you bring a guest." "Welcome, senorita." Rosa, this is Miss Elizabeth Anderson, our new school teacher. Elizabeth, this is Rosa Mendez. She's kept house for me since my father died, and without her, I'd probably still be eating beans straight from the can. Rosa beamed at the introduction. The teacher. Yes, Enrique told me about you. Come in, come in. I will make lemonade. The interior of the ranch house surprised Elizabeth. She had expected something rustic and masculine, but while the furnishings were indeed sturdy and practical, there was an unexpected refinement in the details. Books lined the shelves of the study. A piano stood in one corner of the parlor, and the dining room featured a handsome table that could seat 12. This isn't what I expected, Elizabeth admitted as Drake showed her around. He smiled. My mother died when I was young, but she left her mark on the place, and my father, for all his rough edges, appreciated beautiful things. He ran his hand along the piano's polished surface. He bought this for her as a wedding present, had it shipped all the way from St. Louis. You play badly, he admitted with a laugh. Another thing that teacher tried to drum into my head. I can manage Camptown races if pressed, but that's about it. I could teach you, Elizabeth offered. I gave piano lessons in Boston. I'd like that. Rosa brought lemonade and a plate of fresh baked cookies to the parlor, then tactfully withdrew, though Elizabeth noticed she left the door conspicuously open, a nod to propriety that she appreciated. As they sipped their drinks, Drake seemed to be gathering his thoughts. Finally, he set his glass down and turned to face Elizabeth fully. I need to be honest with you about something, he said, his expression serious. Elizabeth's heart sank. Here it came, the revelation that would shatter the dream that had been building since their first meeting. Perhaps he was already engaged to someone else, or he was planning to sell the ranch and move away, or, I'm falling in love with you, Drake said simply. And it terrifies me. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. It terrifies you, he nodded, his blue eyes intent on hers. I've spent most of my adult life alone, Elizabeth, content with my books and my ranch and the occasional trip to Tucson for supplies. I never expected to meet someone who could make me question whether that was enough. He took a deep breath. But then you screamed in the street, and everything changed. Despite the seriousness of the moment, Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh. That's certainly a unique beginning to a romance. His face relaxed into a smile. It is, isn't it? But it's true. Your courage that day, the way you held your head high despite everything, it moved something in me that I didn't know was there. He reached for her hand. I know it's too soon. We've known each other barely a week. But I wanted you to understand why I've been so attentive. Elizabeth's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. Drake, She swallowed hard, gathering her courage. I'm falling in love with you too. The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the desert. Really? Even though I'm just a rough cowboy who lives in the middle of nowhere, you're hardly just anything, she corrected him. You're the most honorable, kind, intelligent man I've ever known. And as for living in the middle of nowhere, she glanced around the comfortable room. This feels more like home to me than anywhere I've been since my father died. Drake raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. Then perhaps in time it could become your home in truth. The implication was clear, and Elizabeth felt a rush of happiness so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Perhaps it could. They spent the afternoon touring the ranch, Drake proudly showing her the improvements he had made over the years, the irrigation system that allowed them to grow hay for winter feed, the breeding program that had strengthened their herd, the schoolroom he had set up in one of the outbuildings where Enrique taught the ranch children during the winter months when travel to town was difficult. They'll come to your school now that the weather's good, Drake explained. 7 children altogether. They're eager to meet you. As the afternoon waned, Drake reluctantly admitted it was time to take her back to town. "You have a busy day tomorrow, first day of school." The drive back to Agua Caliente was peaceful, both of them content in the knowledge that something precious had begun between them. At the boarding house door, Drake kissed her gently. "Good luck tomorrow, you'll be wonderful. Thank you for everything." He tipped his hat with a smile. "Just the beginning, Elizabeth. Just the beginning." Morning brought butterflies to Elizabeth's stomach as she dressed for her first day of teaching. She chose a practical navy blue dress with a white collar, professional, but not intimidating for the children. After a hasty breakfast, she gathered her books and supplies and set off for the schoolhouse. To her surprise, Drake was waiting outside the building, standing beside a table laden with apples. "What's this?" she asked, smiling. "An old tradition. An apple for the teacher on the first day." He gestured to the table. "One for each student to give you, thought it might help break the ice." Elizabeth was touched by his thoughtfulness. "That's a wonderful idea, thank you." He squeezed her hand briefly. "You'll do fine. I'll stop by after school to hear how it went." The children began arriving shortly after, some eager, some shy, a few openly suspicious. Each found the apple at their place on the table outside, and after a nudge from their parents, presented it to Elizabeth with varying degrees of enthusiasm. By 9 o'clock, 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 16 had assembled in the newly repaired schoolhouse. Elizabeth took a deep breath and rang the bell to officially begin the school day. "Good morning, children. I'm Miss Anderson, and I'm very pleased to be your teacher." The day was challenging but rewarding. The children's abilities varied widely. Some could barely recognize their letters, while others read fluently. Elizabeth organized them into groups based on skill level and set them to work, moving between groups to provide instruction. By the end of the day, she was exhausted but exhilarated. Most of the children had responded well to her approach, though a few, notably Orville Jenkins' sons, had been deliberately disruptive. Still, it was a promising start. As promised, Drake appeared as the children were leaving, his tall figure lounging in the doorway as she tidied up. "How was it?" he asked. Elizabeth smiled wearily. "Wonderful and terrible and exhausting, but mostly wonderful. Any trouble from the Jenkins boys?" she shrugged. "Nothing I couldn't handle. They'll come around eventually." Drake crossed the room to help her stack the slates. "You're optimistic." "I have to be. Every child deserves an education, even ones with difficult fathers." She straightened a row of books. "Speaking of which, 7 of your ranch children were here today. They're bright, especially Maria Lopez. She has a gift for mathematics. That's Rosa's niece. Sharp as a tack, that one." They finished cleaning in comfortable silence. As they were leaving, Drake hesitated, then asked, "Would you have dinner with me Saturday, at the ranch? Rosa's been asking when she can cook for you properly." "I'd love to." The rest of the week fell into a pattern. Elizabeth taught during the day, gradually winning over most of her students with her patience and genuine interest in their progress. Drake stopped by nearly every afternoon, sometimes bringing small gifts for the school, a new book, pencils, or once, a beautiful globe that must have cost a small fortune. In the evenings, Elizabeth prepared lessons and graded the children's work, often thinking about Drake and the future that seemed to be unfolding before them. It was happening so quickly, this connection between them, but it felt right in a way nothing else in her life ever had. Saturday evening found her again at the Double I Ranch, this time for a formal dinner. Rosa had outdone herself with a feast of roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables from the ranch's garden, and a spectacular apple pie for dessert. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Drake's arm was around her shoulders, and Elizabeth leaned into him, feeling perfectly content. "I've been thinking," Drake said after a comfortable silence. "The school term ends in June. What will you do then? Return to Boston for the summer?" The question hadn't occurred to Elizabeth. I don't know. There's nothing for me in Boston anymore." Drake's arm tightened slightly. "Stay here. Agua Caliente is pleasant enough in summer if you know how to manage the heat. And the ranch is cooler being higher up." "Are you offering me a summer position, Mr. Irwin?" she teased, looking up at him. His expression was serious, his blue eyes intent. "I'm offering you a permanent one, Miss Anderson, if you'll have me." Elizabeth's breath caught. "Drake." He shifted to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know it's fast, too fast by any reasonable standard, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He squeezed her hands gently. "I love you, Elizabeth. I want to marry you." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too, and yes, I'll marry you." Drake pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling so broadly it hurt. "When?" he asked. "I'd marry you tomorrow if you'd agree, but I suspect you'll want something more proper." Elizabeth laughed. "A little more proper, yes, but I don't need anything elaborate. Perhaps after the school term ends. That would give us time to make arrangements." "June it is, then." Drake brushed a strand of hair from her face tenderly. 2 months seems like an eternity. It will pass quickly enough with school keeping me busy." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, both practical and fanciful. Drake wanted to build an addition to the ranch house, a proper library where Elizabeth could continue her studies and perhaps tutor advanced students. Elizabeth dreamed of expanding the school in town, perhaps eventually adding a second teacher for the younger children while she focused on the older ones. When it came time for him to take her back to town, neither wanted the evening to end. Their goodnight kiss at the boarding house was lingering and full of promise. "I'll see you at church tomorrow," Drake said, reluctantly releasing her. "I'll be the one in the blue bonnet, looking forward to June," Elizabeth replied with a smile. The news of their engagement spread through Agua Caliente like wildfire. By Monday morning, it seemed everyone in town knew that Drake Irwin, owner of the Double I Ranch, was going to marry the Eastern school teacher. Reactions were mixed. Many congratulated Elizabeth sincerely, especially the parents of her more successful students. Others, like Martha Steele, offered tight-lipped good wishes that didn't reach their eyes. And Orville Jenkins made no secret of his displeasure, loudly proclaiming in the saloon that Drake was making a fool of himself over that city woman. Elizabeth did her best to ignore the gossip and focus on her teaching. With Drake's support, she had been able to order more books and supplies from Tucson, and as they arrived, the quality of education she could offer improved dramatically. The children responded well to her methods, even the initially resistant ones. By the end of April, even the Jenkins boys were participating in lessons, drawn in despite themselves by Elizabeth's engaging teaching style and genuine interest in their progress. May brought warmer weather and preparations for the end-of-term examinations. Elizabeth worked tirelessly to ensure that each child would show improvement, knowing that the town's continued acceptance of her hinged partly on demonstrable results. Drake was a constant support, visiting the school regularly and often joining her for dinner at the boarding house. Their plans for June were coming together nicely. Reverend Collins would perform the ceremony in the church, followed by a reception at the ranch. Elizabeth had written to her few remaining friends in Boston, though she doubted any would make the long journey to Arizona for the wedding. One evening in mid-May, Drake arrived at the boarding house looking troubled. Elizabeth immediately sensed something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked as they settled in Mrs. Whittaker's parlor. The landlady, sensing a serious conversation, had tactfully made herself scarce. Drake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of agitation. "There's trouble brewing. Jenkins has been stirring things up in town, saying you're filling the children's heads with Eastern ideas that don't belong here." Elizabeth sighed. "I'm teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic, Drake, the same as any teacher would. I know that. But Jenkins has convinced some of the other ranchers that you're somehow undermining their authority." Drake took her hand. "It's not serious yet, but I wanted you to be aware." "What can we do?" He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "The end-of-term examinations are in 2 weeks. When the town sees how much the children have learned, it will silence the critics. Until then, just be careful." But the next day brought the first direct confrontation. Elizabeth was teaching a geography lesson when Orville Jenkins burst into the schoolhouse, his face flushed with anger. "My boy tells me you're teaching them that slavery was wrong," he accused, pointing a finger at Elizabeth. "Filling their heads with Northern propaganda." Elizabeth remained calm, though her heart was racing. "Mr. Jenkins, we were discussing the Civil War as part of our American history lessons. I presented the facts as they are recorded in our textbook." "Facts?" Jenkins spat. "Northern facts, maybe. My grandfather died fighting for the Confederacy. You have no right to tell my boys he was wrong." The children were watching wide-eyed, and Elizabeth was acutely aware of her responsibility to handle the situation without escalating it. "Mr. Jenkins, I understand this is a sensitive topic. Perhaps we could discuss it after school hours." She gestured toward the door. "The children are trying to learn." For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he gave a curt nod. "Fine. After school, but this isn't over, Miss Anderson." As he stomped out, Elizabeth took a deep breath to steady herself. "Now, children, where were we? Ah, yes, the Missouri Compromise." She continued the lesson as if nothing had happened, but inside she was shaking. When the school day ended and the children had filed out, she remained at her desk, dreading Jenkins' return. But it wasn't Jenkins who appeared in the doorway, it was Drake, his expression grim. "I heard about what happened," he said, crossing to her side. "Are you all right? How did you know?" "Small town. Word travels fast." He pulled up a chair beside her desk. "Jenkins went to the saloon instead of coming back here. He's drinking heavily and making threats." Elizabeth felt cold fear wash over her. "Threats? Against me?" Drake nodded grimly. "Nothing specific, just drunk talk about running you out of town. But I'm not taking chances." He took her hands in his. "I want you to stay at the ranch until this blows over." "Drake, I can't do that. It would cause a scandal, and it would only give Jenkins more ammunition against me." "Then stay with Rosa in the housekeeper's cottage. It would be perfectly proper and you'd be safe." Elizabeth considered the option. It would mean a long daily ride to and from the schoolhouse, but it would remove her from the immediate tensions in town. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "But just until the examinations. After that, if things haven't improved, we'll need another solution." Drake insisted on escorting her to the boarding house to pack some belongings. As they walked through town, Elizabeth was aware of hostile stares from several men lounging outside the saloon. "Ignore them," Drake murmured. "They're just Jenkins' cronies." At the boarding house, Mrs. Whittaker was distressed to hear about the situation but understood the precaution. "You be careful, dear. Some of these men have nasty tempers when they're drinking." Within the hour, Elizabeth was settled in the cozy housekeeper's cottage at the Double I Ranch. Rosa fussed over her, making sure she had everything she needed and promising to prepare her favorite dishes for dinner. "Do not worry, señorita," the housekeeper said confidently. "Señor Drake will not let anything happen to you." The next morning, Drake drove Elizabeth to the schoolhouse in his buggy, arriving early to ensure no one was waiting to cause trouble. The school day passed without incident, though Elizabeth noticed several of her students seemed subdued, especially the Jenkins boys. As the final bell rang, Elizabeth was surprised to see the oldest Jenkins boy, 12-year-old Timothy, hanging back while the others left. "Did you need something, Timothy?" she asked. The boy shuffled his feet, looking uncomfortable. "Pa says we ain't supposed to listen to you no more, says you're teaching us lies." Elizabeth's heart sank. "I see. And what do you think, Timothy?" He looked up, his expression troubled. "I don't think you're lying. The things in the books make sense, and I like learning." He glanced toward the door nervously. "But Pa gets real mad when he's been drinking." "I understand." Elizabeth approached the boy slowly, not wanting to frighten him. "Timothy, is everything all right at home?" The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. "Pa's just angry a lot since Ma died. He don't mean nothing by it." But the bruise partially visible on the boy's arm told a different story. Elizabeth felt sick. "If you ever need help, Timothy, you can come to me, or to Mr. Irwin. Do you understand?" Timothy nodded solemnly. "Yes, madam." He turned to go, then hesitated. "Miss Anderson, I'm still gonna study for the examinations, even if Pa says not to." "I'm very glad to hear that, Timothy." When Drake arrived to pick her up, Elizabeth told him about the conversation with Timothy Jenkins. Drake's expression darkened. "I've heard rumors about how Jenkins treats those boys. Nothing concrete enough to act on, but—" He shook his head in frustration. "I'll keep an eye on them." The pattern continued for the next week. Each morning, Drake drove Elizabeth to the schoolhouse. Each afternoon, he picked her up. The tensions in town seemed to be growing rather than subsiding. Twice, Elizabeth spotted Jenkins outside the saloon, watching her with undisguised hostility as they passed. Despite the stressful situation, Elizabeth found herself enjoying her time at the ranch. In the evenings, after dinner with Drake in the main house, they would sit on the porch, planning their future together. The wedding was now less than a month away, and despite everything, Elizabeth couldn't wait to become Mrs. Drake Irwin. 10 days before the end of term examinations, disaster struck. Elizabeth was in the middle of a mathematics lesson when she smelled smoke. At first, she thought it might be coming from outside, perhaps a controlled burn in one of the nearby fields. But then she noticed tendrils of smoke seeping through the floorboards near the back of the room. "Children," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I need you to line up at the door immediately. We're going to go outside for a special lesson." The older students caught on quickly, helping to organize the younger ones. Elizabeth counted heads as they filed out, making sure no one was left behind. They had barely cleared the building when flames became visible, licking up the back wall of the schoolhouse. "Stay together," Elizabeth instructed, moving the children to a safe distance. "Thomas, run to the general store and tell Mr. Parsons to ring the alarm bell." The 14-year-old boy took off running. Within minutes, the town's makeshift fire brigade had assembled, but it was too late. The schoolhouse, built of seasoned timber dried by the Arizona sun, was fully engulfed. Elizabeth watched in horror as the building she had come to love was reduced to ashes before her eyes. All their books, the new supplies, the carefully crafted teaching materials all gone. Drake arrived in the midst of the chaos, having seen the smoke from the ranch. He found Elizabeth standing with her students, her face pale but composed as she kept the children calm and organized. "Is everyone safe?" he asked urgently. Elizabeth nodded. "All accounted for." "We smelled the smoke in time." Drake's expression was grim as he surveyed the burning building. "This wasn't an accident." "I know," Elizabeth said quietly. "The fire started under the floor at the back. Someone must have crawled under the building and set it deliberately. By now, most of the town had gathered to watch the schoolhouse burn. The fire brigade had given up trying to save the building and was focusing on preventing the flames from spreading to nearby structures. In the crowd, Elizabeth spotted Orville Jenkins, a satisfied smirk on his face as he watched the destruction. Beside him stood his sons, Timothy's expression one of barely concealed anguish. Drake followed her gaze and swore under his breath. "I can't prove he did it, but I'd bet my ranch he was involved." "The examinations are next week," Elizabeth said numbly. "All my materials, all our work." Drake put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure something out." As the crowd began to disperse, Mayor Hollis approached them, his expression troubled. "Miss Anderson, this is a terrible tragedy. Do you have any idea how it started?" "It was deliberately set, Mayor," Drake answered before Elizabeth could speak. "And I think we all have a good idea who might be responsible." The mayor glanced nervously at Jenkins, who was now heading toward the saloon. "That's a serious accusation, Drake. Without proof—" "I understand," Drake interrupted, "but something needs to be done. This has gone beyond simple disagreement to destruction of town property." Mayor Hollis sighed. "The town council will meet tonight to discuss the situation. In the meantime, Miss Anderson, what about your students? The examinations are scheduled for next week." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "The examinations will proceed as planned, Mayor Hollis. We'll hold classes in the church until other arrangements can be made. As for materials—" She faltered, thinking of all that had been lost. "The Double I Ranch will provide whatever is needed," Drake said firmly. "Books, slates, paper, everything." Parents began arriving to collect their children, expressing shock and outrage at the destruction of the schoolhouse. Many offered support to Elizabeth, promising to help however they could. It was a heartening response, suggesting that despite Jenkins' efforts, she had won over a significant portion of the community. As the last of the students departed, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to give in to the shock and grief she had been holding at bay. Drake led her to his buggy and helped her in, his arm steady around her shoulders. "It's gone," she whispered. "Everything we worked for." "The building is gone," Drake corrected gently. "But not everything. The children still have what you've taught them. That can't be burned away." Elizabeth leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "You're right, and we'll rebuild, better than before. That's my girl." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Now let's get you home." The next morning, Elizabeth faced her students in the church, where Reverend Collins had hastily arranged benches and a small table to serve as her desk. The children were subdued but eager to continue their lessons. "I know yesterday was frightening," Elizabeth began, "and I know we've lost our books and supplies, but we haven't lost what's most important, our determination to learn." She had spent half the night preparing lessons that could be taught with minimal materials. Drake had provided paper and pencils from his ranch office, and Elizabeth had salvaged what she could from memory. To her surprise, several students had brought books from home, treasured volumes that families had agreed to loan to the school. Mrs. Carter brought a set of geography cards that had belonged to her grandfather. Mr. Parsons from the general store donated a box of chalk and a portable slate board. Most touching of all was Timothy Jenkins, who arrived with a battered copy of McGuffey's Reader and a look of defiance that suggested he had taken it without his father's knowledge. "My ma used to read to me from this," he told Elizabeth quietly. "Pa don't know I kept it." "You can use it for the little ones." The community's response brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. By midday, they had assembled a makeshift collection of educational materials that, while not ideal, would allow them to continue until the examinations. Drake arrived at lunchtime, bringing food for all the children and news from the town council meeting. "They've agreed to rebuild the schoolhouse," he told Elizabeth, "bigger and better than before. Construction will start as soon as materials can be shipped from Tucson." "And Jenkins?" Drake's expression darkened. "No proof that he was involved in the fire, but the marshal is keeping a close eye on him." The days leading up to the examinations were challenging but rewarding. Elizabeth was touched by the way the town had rallied around the school, proving that Jenkins' views were not as widely shared as she had feared. On the morning of the examinations, Elizabeth arrived at the church to find it transformed. Someone had hung a banner reading "Agua Caliente School Examinations" over the entrance. Flowers decorated the makeshift classroom, and a table of refreshments had been set up for afterward. The students filed in nervously, dressed in their Sunday best. Parents and town officials, including Mayor Hollies, sat in the back to observe. Even Mrs. Steele, who had been one of Elizabeth's earliest critics, was present, her expression curious rather than hostile. Elizabeth administered the examinations with calm efficiency, moving from subject to subject as the morning progressed. The children, despite the disruption of the past 2 weeks, performed admirably. Even the youngest demonstrated significant progress since the beginning of the term. Most impressive was Timothy Jenkins, who answered every question correctly on the advanced mathematics examination, a subject his father had particularly objected to as being unnecessary for a ranch boy. By noon, it was clear to everyone present that Elizabeth's teaching methods had produced remarkable results. Mayor Hollies approached her as the children were enjoying the refreshments, his hand extended. "Miss Anderson, I must congratulate you. What these children have accomplished in such a short time and under such difficult circumstances is nothing short of miraculous." "Thank you, Mayor. The credit belongs to the students themselves. They worked extremely hard." "And to their teacher," Drake added, joining them. He had been sitting proudly in the back throughout the examinations. "I think we can all agree that Agua Caliente is fortunate to have Miss Anderson." There was a chorus of agreement from the assembled parents. Elizabeth felt a wave of gratitude and relief wash over her. Despite everything, she had succeeded. The children had learned, the town had accepted her, and in 2 weeks she would marry the man she loved. But their triumph was short-lived. As the gathering was breaking up, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Elizabeth stepped onto the church porch to see Orville Jenkins staggering up the street, clearly drunk despite the early hour. His rifle was clenched in one hand, and his face was contorted with rage. "Where is she?" he bellowed. "Where's that Boston witch who's turned my boy against me?" Drake moved quickly, positioning himself in front of Elizabeth. "Jenkins, put down the rifle. You're drunk and making a fool of yourself." Jenkins raised the rifle, pointing it unsteadily in their direction. "She's ruined everything, filling the boys' heads with ideas above their station. Timothy told me he wants to go to college." "College?" He spat the word like a curse. "No son of mine is leaving the ranch for some fancy education." People scattered, mothers pulling children to safety, men moving to protect their families. Marshal Davis appeared from the direction of his office, his own weapon drawn. "Put it down, Jenkins," the marshal ordered. "This has gone far enough." Jenkins ignored him, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Elizabeth. "You think you're so smart with your books and your fancy ways. But you don't belong here. Never did." "That's where you're wrong, Jenkins," Drake said, his voice steady despite the rifle aimed in their direction. "Elizabeth belongs here more than you do. She's done nothing but good for this town while you've done nothing but cause trouble." Jenkins' face darkened with fury. "You're as bad as she is, Irwin. Turned your back on your own kind for a woman who'll never really understand our ways." "Lower the rifle, Jenkins," Marshall Davis repeated, moving closer. "Don't make this worse than it already is." For a tense moment, it seemed Jenkins might actually fire. Then, unexpectedly, Timothy broke from the crowd and ran to stand in front of his father. "Pa, stop," the boy pleaded. "Miss Anderson ain't done nothing wrong. She just taught us like she was supposed to." Jenkins' hands trembled on the rifle. "Get out of the way, boy." "No, Pa, I won't let you hurt her." Timothy's voice shook, but he stood his ground. "Ma wouldn't want this. You know she wouldn't." At the mention of his late wife, something in Jenkins' expression crumbled. The rifle lowered slightly. Marshall Davis seized the opportunity, moving swiftly to disarm Jenkins before he could change his mind. Two deputies appeared to help restrain the struggling man. "You're going to jail, Jenkins," the marshal said grimly. "Threatening folks with a loaded weapon is serious business." As they led Jenkins away, he shouted over his shoulder, "This ain't over, you hear me? This ain't over." Timothy stood alone in the street, watching his father being dragged to the jail. Elizabeth's heart went out to the boy. She approached him carefully, aware of his fragile emotional state. "Timothy, I'm so sorry." The boy looked up at her, his eyes dry but haunted. "It ain't your fault, Miss Anderson. Pa's been like this since Ma died, getting worse all the time." Drake joined them, placing a gentle hand on Timothy's shoulder. "Where are your brothers, son?" "At home. Pa left them there when he came to town." Drake exchanged a concerned glance with Elizabeth. "They're alone," Timothy nodded miserably. "Billy's only 8 and Jack's 10. They'll be scared." "I'll send someone for them," Drake assured him. "In the meantime, you'll stay with us at the ranch." "What'll happen to Pa?" It was Marshall Davis who answered, having returned from the jail. "He'll be held until the circuit judge arrives next week. What happens then depends on whether anyone wants to press charges." All eyes turned to Elizabeth. She hesitated, thinking of the burned schoolhouse, the threats, the fear she had lived with for the past 2 weeks. But then she looked at Timothy's face, at the silent plea in his eyes. "I won't press charges for the threats today," she said finally. "As for the schoolhouse, there's no proof Mr. Jenkins was involved." Relief washed over Timothy's features. "Thank you, Miss Anderson." Drake raised an eyebrow at her decision but didn't question it. Instead, he turned to the marshal. "What about the boys? They can't go back to Jenkins, not after this." Marshall Davis sighed. "That's for the judge to decide. But given Jenkins' behavior, I'd say there's a good chance they'll be removed from his care, at least temporarily." "They can stay at the Double I until things are sorted out," Drake offered. "We've plenty of room and Rosa loves children." As the crowd dispersed, Elizabeth found herself exhausted by the emotional roller coaster of the day. What should have been a triumph, the successful examinations, had been overshadowed by Jenkins' violent outburst. Drake seemed to sense her mood. "You're disappointed," he said as they walked back to his buggy. "I thought we'd won," Elizabeth admitted. "That the town had accepted me, that Jenkins was isolated in his views. But now the town has seen exactly who Jenkins is," Drake finished. "And they've seen who you are too, someone who shows compassion even to the family of a man who threatened her life." He helped her into the buggy. "Elizabeth, today was a victory. Not the one you expected, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless." As they drove back to the ranch, Elizabeth found herself agreeing with him. Despite the drama, the examinations had demonstrated conclusively the value of her teaching methods. The children had excelled, the parents were impressed, and even former critics like Mrs. Steele had acknowledged her success. More importantly, she had stood her ground against fear and intimidation. She had refused to run away, refused to compromise her principles. And in doing so, she had won the respect of the community she now called home. At the ranch, they found Rosa already preparing rooms for the Jenkins boys. Enrique had gone to fetch them, taking a wagon and another ranch hand for support in case there was trouble. "Those poor niños," Rosa clucked sympathetically, "to have such a father." Elizabeth helped prepare the rooms, making sure there were clean clothes and toys appropriate for the younger boys. As she worked, she found herself thinking of the family she and Drake would have someday, children raised with love and respect, taught to value education and kindness. The thought made her smile despite the day's upheaval. In 2 weeks, she would be Mrs. Drake Irwin. They would build a life together at the Double I Ranch, continuing their work to improve education in Agua Caliente and perhaps extending their influence throughout the territory. Enrique returned with Billy and Jack Jenkins just before sunset. The boys were frightened and confused, clinging to Timothy as the only familiar presence in their new surroundings. Elizabeth approached them gently, introducing herself as their teacher. "You're safe here," she assured them. "Mr. Irwin and I will take care of you until things are sorted out with your father." "Is Pa going to hang?" Billy asked, his lower lip trembling. "No, sweetheart," Elizabeth said quickly. "He's in trouble, but he's not going to hang." "He was real mad about the examinations," Jack offered. "Said Timothy was getting too big for his britches, wanting to learn things Pa didn't know." Drake knelt to the boy's level. "Your brother did very well today. You should be proud of him. And you can do well too if you want to learn." Billy's eyes widened. "Even me." "Pa says I'm too stupid for book learning." "Your pa is wrong," Drake said firmly. "Every child can learn. Miss Anderson will help you, just as she helped Timothy." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. The Jenkins boys settled into life at the ranch, gradually losing their wariness and beginning to thrive under the care of Drake, Elizabeth, and the ranch staff. The circuit judge arrived in Agua Caliente, and after reviewing the evidence, sentenced Orville Jenkins to 6 months in the territorial prison for public endangerment. More significantly, he awarded temporary custody of the 3 boys to Drake, with Elizabeth named as their educational guardian. "It's an unusual arrangement," the judge admitted, "but given the circumstances and the boys' obvious attachment to you both, it seems the best solution." Construction began on the new schoolhouse, with Drake donating lumber from his ranch and many townspeople volunteering labor. The building would be larger than before, with proper windows for ventilation, a small library area, and an apartment above for a teacher. "Though I hope the teacher will be living elsewhere," Drake commented with a smile as they inspected the plans. "At the Double I Ranch with her husband," Elizabeth agreed, returning his smile. "But it will be useful for future teachers." Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the June sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. Elizabeth dressed in her room at the ranch, where she had moved the day before, properly chaperoned by Rosa. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant white satin with lace trim that Mrs. Whittaker and several other women from town had helped create. Rosa arranged Elizabeth's hair, weaving flowers into the chestnut waves. "You are beautiful, señorita. Señor Drake will be speechless." A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Whittaker, beaming with maternal pride. "Oh, my dear, you're a vision." "Is everything ready?" Elizabeth asked nervously. "The church is full to bursting," Mrs. Whittaker confirmed. "I do believe the entire town has come to see you married. Even Mrs. Steele is there in her finest hat." Elizabeth laughed. "Wonders never cease." The ride to the church in Drake's finest buggy, decorated with ribbons and flowers for the occasion, seemed both endless and too brief. Mayor Hollies was waiting to escort her down the aisle, having offered to stand in for her father. "Ready, my dear?" he asked, offering his arm. Elizabeth took a deep breath. More than ready. The church doors opened, and Elizabeth caught her first glimpse of Drake standing at the altar. He was resplendent in a new black suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that it brought tears to her eyes. As she walked down the aisle on Mayor Holly's arm, Elizabeth was aware of the smiling faces of the townspeople, the same people who had laughed at her screams in the street just 2 months ago. Now they stood to honor her, to celebrate her marriage to the man they respected above all others. Reverend Collins beamed as she reached the altar. Drake took her hands in his grip warm and steady. "You are so beautiful," he whispered for her ears alone. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for all their days. Drake's voice was clear and confident as he made his promises. Elizabeth's trembled slightly with emotion but grew stronger with each word. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Drake pulled her into a kiss that was both tender and passionate, heedless of the crowd watching. The church erupted in cheers and applause. The reception at the Double I Ranch was a joyous affair. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by Rosa and the women of the town. A band played lively tunes, and couples danced on a wooden platform Drake's men had constructed for the occasion. The Jenkins boys, clean and smartly dressed, acted as unofficial hosts, proudly showing guests around the ranch. Timothy, in particular, seemed to have found his place, shadowing Drake and already talking about learning the ranching business. As the celebration continued into the evening, Drake led Elizabeth away from the crowd to the quieter area near the creek where they had shared their first lunch together. "Happy, Mrs. Irwin?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Incredibly happy, Mr. Irwin." She leaned into his embrace. "Though I still can't quite believe how we got here, from that first day in town when they laughed at me, to now when they celebrate with us." Drake kissed the top of her head. "You changed them, Elizabeth. You stood your ground, showed them a better way." "We changed them," she corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." Drake smiled. "Perhaps we were meant to do it together." As twilight deepened into night, the guests began to depart, calling good wishes to the bride and groom. The Jenkins boys were settled in their rooms, Rosa keeping a watchful eye on them to allow the newlyweds privacy. Finally, Drake led Elizabeth to the main house, their house now. He paused at the threshold, then swept her into his arms to carry her over it in the traditional manner. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irwin," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the parlor. "Home," Elizabeth repeated, savoring the word. "It truly is, isn't it? I never thought I'd find a home again after leaving Boston. And I never thought the home I had would be complete until you screamed in the middle of town," Drake replied with a teasing smile. Elizabeth laughed, remembering that moment that had seemed so terrible at the time but had led to everything good in her life. "They laughed when I screamed," she said softly. Drake pulled her close. "And now we laugh together," he finished, his lips finding hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of happiness. 5 years later, Elizabeth sat on the porch of the main house at the Double I Ranch, watching her 3-year-old son, Isaac, chasing butterflies in the yard. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, where their second child, a daughter, she was certain was due to arrive within the month. Drake emerged from the house, carrying a tray with lemonade and cookies. "Rosa says you're not drinking enough in this heat," he said, setting the tray on the small table between their chairs. Elizabeth smiled up at her husband. The years had been kind to them both, but especially to Drake. At 38, he was in his prime, his business acumen and natural leadership having expanded the Double I into one of the most successful ranches in the territory. The touch of silver at his temples only added to his distinguished appearance. "I'm fine," she assured him. just enjoying watching Isaac play. Drake sat beside her, his hand automatically finding hers. He's growing too fast. They all do. Elizabeth's gaze drifted to the bunkhouse, where Timothy Jenkins, now 17 and Drake's right-hand man on the ranch, was teaching his brothers to rope. The boys had thrived under their care. Timothy had developed into a responsible young man with plans to attend college in Denver the following year, studying ranch management and business. Jack, at 15, showed a talent for working with horses, while 12-year-old Billy had inherited Elizabeth's love of books and learning. Orville Jenkins had served his prison sentence and left Arizona upon release, heading to California without attempting to reclaim his sons. The judge had made their guardianship permanent, and while they kept the Jenkins name, the boys were Irwins in every way that mattered. "The school board meeting went well yesterday," Drake commented, sipping his lemonade. "They approved the funds for a second teacher." Elizabeth nodded in satisfaction. "It's about time. We have 38 students now. Miss Parker can't handle them all alone." The new schoolhouse had been completed 4 years ago, larger and sturdier than its predecessor, with proper desks, ample books, and educational materials. Elizabeth had continued teaching until Isaac's birth, then reluctantly stepped back to focus on her growing family and the ranch. But she remained actively involved in educational matters, serving on the school board and mentoring the young teacher who had taken her place. "I was thinking," Drake said, his tone casual but his eyes intent, "that when the children are a bit older you might want to open that secondary school you've been talking about." Elizabeth sat up straighter, excitement coursing through her. "Really? You think Agua Caliente is ready for that?" "I think Agua Caliente has changed a lot in 5 years," Drake replied. "And a good part of that change is because of you." It was true. The town had grown and prospered, attracting new families and businesses. Many of the original residents who had been suspicious of Eastern ideas had become their strongest supporters after seeing the benefits of education and progress. "You give me too much credit," Elizabeth protested. "The town was ready to grow, it just needed a little push." Drake laughed. "A little push" named Elizabeth Anderson, who screamed in the street and then refused to back down. Elizabeth smiled at the memory. What had once been her most humiliating moment had become a cherished part of their family lore, the moment that had brought them together. "They laughed when I screamed," she reminded him, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "And now we laugh louder than anyone," Drake finished, pulling her closer for a proper kiss. Their son chose that moment to run up the porch steps, demanding attention. Drake scooped him up, tossing him in the air to delighted squeals. "Papa, high," Isaac demanded. "Higher than the clouds," Drake agreed, lifting the boy again. Elizabeth watched them, her heart full to bursting with love for her family, her husband, their son, the child on the way, and the 3 boys who had become so dear to them. From the ashes of her old life in Boston, she had built something more wonderful than she could have imagined. And it had all begun with a scream, laughter, and a cowboy who knew the value of laughing louder.